The girl stood barefoot on the wooden platform, a crust of dirt on her face and her small hands knotted behind her. No one knew her name. No one asked. A gust of wind tugged at the hem of her too-short dress, the kind worn by saloon girls long discarded by better days. Her eyes, though, those didn't belong to any child. They were dark wells, still and watchful, and they never blinked. Behind her, the auctioneer raised his voice to compete with the wind. 8 years, maybe 9. Can't speak, don't cry, and eats like a sparrow. Good for chores. Strong back, quiet mouth. Laughter flared from the edges of the crowd, men with unshaven jaws, tobacco-stained teeth, and hearts hardened by drought. One called out, "Does she come with a refund if she bites?" The crowd laughed again. The girl didn't move. A little farther back, leaning against the rail post with a flask hidden in his coat, stood Elias Grant. Tall, lean, and worn to the bone, he looked like a man carved from what was left of a house struck by lightning. He hadn't come to buy anyone. He'd come to trade his last sack of oats for seed, or maybe for whiskey, if the price of failure proved too heavy. But something about the girl made him stay. Maybe it was her silence. Maybe it was the way the wind didn't seem to touch her. Maybe it was nothing more than the ache in his bones that no amount of whiskey could wash away. The auctioneer squinted through the dust. No bids? Come on now, she ain't cursed. Not officially. He laughed. No one joined him. A hand went up. Rough, calloused, shaking slightly from years of work and too little rest. The crowd turned. $3.40, Elias said. His voice didn't carry like it used to. Still it cut the air. Someone chuckled. You trying to raise yourself a ghost, Grant? He ignored them. The auctioneer looked surprised, then pleased. $3.40 it is. Going once. I'll throw in a crust of bread, said another man just to mock. Sold. The gavel slammed down and that was it. The girl was his. She stepped off the platform with no hesitation, no fear, and walked to Elias like she already knew the shape of his shadow. She stood beside him, looking up once, just once, with those two old eyes. Elias didn't speak. He handed over the coins, gathered what little was left of his pride, and turned to leave. As they walked away, someone shouted, "Maybe she'll do better than your last one." That was the only time Elias stopped. Not to answer. Just to stare down the road ahead like it was longer than the miles it promised. Then he walked on. The girl didn't look back. Back at the ranch, nothing had changed. The wind still moaned through the cracked windows. The rocking chair still swayed when no one sat in it. His late wife's apron still hung from a nail by the door, untouched for 5 years. He gestured toward the cot by the fire. You can sleep there. She nodded. I ain't got no name for you, he added. She didn't answer, just knelt by the hearth and began to sweep the ashes with her fingers. That night, Elias couldn't sleep. He kept the lamp low, the rifle closer, and his eyes on the shadows. At some point she began to hum, soft and low, not like a song, but like a sound remembered from another life. Elias shut his eyes tight. But the hum kept coming. By dawn she'd arranged all the spoons in a perfect circle on the kitchen table. When Elias saw it, he didn't ask why. He just pushed the circle aside and poured himself coffee thick as tar. I'll call you Junie, he said. She looked up. Didn't smile. But her hand paused over the flour bag as if she understood. He meant it as a joke. His wife's name had been Lily. Junie was the flower that bloomed when the last of winter's bites still clung to the air. By the third day she'd cleared the chicken coop, patched a broken shutter, and filled a cracked bucket with creek water that was 3 hills over. She ain't right, said his neighbor Mr. Coulter when he came to check Elias's fence. Girls like that, they don't forget the whip. They grow up mean or broken. She ain't mean, Elias replied. Then she's broken. Maybe she was. Elias wasn't sure he wasn't too. At supper, she laid out the table with exactness, knife to the left, spoon straight, napkin folded. She ate slowly, chewing each bite like it might vanish if rushed. One evening he found her outside under the oak tree, arranging small pebbles in patterns. Swirls, circles, spirals that made no sense, but looked like they did to her. He said nothing. She didn't speak. That night it rained. Hard. The roof leaked in 3 spots, 2 of which Elias had forgotten. He woke to the sound of thunder and something else, singing. It wasn't coming from inside. He stepped onto the porch, rifle in hand. The barn doors were ajar. Inside, Junie stood barefoot in the hay, her face streaked with tears and rain. She was humming again the same tune from that first night. Before her, buried beneath straw, was a little wooden doll. Its dress was burnt at the edges, its eyes scratched out. Elias lowered the rifle. She looked at him. He looked at the doll. No words passed between them. But something did. He walked over, knelt down, picked up the doll. He handed it back to her gently. She clutched it tight, and for the first time he saw her lip tremble. He didn't say anything clever. He just touched her shoulder once, then turned to leave. Back at the house, the rocking chair swayed again. But this time he sat in it. And when the girl walked in, doll in hand, and took the chair beside him, he didn't move. He just said, "You sleep inside tonight." She nodded. And that was how it began. A girl with no name and a man with nothing left, sitting side by side while the rain pounded like sorrow against the tin roof. Neither of them knew what would come next. But they both stayed awake to find out. Junie did not speak for the next 3 weeks. Not once. Not a whisper, not a word. Her silence wasn't stubborn, it was careful. Like speech might break something sacred inside her. Elias didn't push. He'd known folks who spoke too much and meant too little. Junie, on the other hand, seemed to mean every silence. Each morning she rose before the sun. She'd sweep the porch, boil water, and sometimes leave strange arrangements on the windowsill. Twigs laid in parallel, feathers fanned like the rays of a sun, or 5 small stones in the shape of a teardrop. Elias noticed. He didn't understand. But he noticed. The town didn't forget the auction. Folks were polite to his face, cruel behind his back. The butcher asked if Elias was taking in strays now. At the general store, a woman muttered, "God help that child if Elias Grant is her last hope." He ignored them. He had work to do and fewer years left to do it. His fields were overgrown, his fences splintered, and the well hadn't been right since the last freeze. Junie helped where she could. Quiet as falling snow, but quicker than most grown hands. When she found an abandoned nest of mice under the grain sacks, she scooped them up in her apron and buried them in the grove, whispering something over the tiny mound. Elias watched from the shadows of the barn. There was something reverent in her movements. Something too old for someone so young. One night he found her drawing in the ash of the hearth. Circles again, always circles, and in the center, a tall figure beside a smaller one. Both without faces. She looked up, caught his eye, and wiped the drawing away with her sleeve. He said nothing. She returned to the fire, her small fingers tightening around the worn doll she now kept tied to her sash with twine. Elias remembered the day he buried his boy. The sky had been that same flat gray. His wife had clutched the boy's blanket like it could still hold warmth, even as the preacher droned through verses Elias had long forgotten. He hadn't prayed that day. He hadn't prayed since. God, it seemed, had stopped listening. But that night, as Junie lay curled on the cot, her face turned toward the dying fire, Elias found himself sitting on the porch, hands clenched, eyes toward the stars. He didn't speak, but he stayed there a long time. The next morning, the sheriff rode up. Sheriff McAllen was a tired man with a strong back and a soft spot for whiskey. He tipped his hat. "Elias, word is someone's been asking about a missing girl. Matches your Junie." Elias tensed. "Who?" "Drifter. Claims he's kin. Says she wandered off from his wagon 3 towns east. Wants her back. She's not livestock. Didn't say she was. Just passing the word." Junie had appeared behind the door, half hidden. Her face had gone still, eyes fixed on the sheriff. "Tell your drifter to keep riding," Elias said. His voice didn't rise, but it had weight. The sheriff nodded. Didn't see much truth in his eyes anyway. When he left, Junie didn't speak. But she stepped outside that night and laid a small, woven charm by the fence post. It looked like a knot of thread and sticks tied with 3 loops. Elias bent to pick it up. She stopped him with a look. He let it be. The next evening, thunderheads rolled over the western hills. The air thickened with dust and warning. Elias boarded the windows, checked the animals. Junie gathered candles without being told. By nightfall the wind howled. The shutters groaned. A tree branch slammed the side of the house like a rifle shot. Junie flinched for the first time. Elias moved toward her, slow, deliberate, and placed one hand on her shoulder. "You're all right," he said. She didn't answer. But she didn't pull away either. When the storm passed, Elias found her out back, barefoot in the mud, staring at something in the distance. He followed her gaze. On the far ridge, just beyond the treeline, a figure stood. Too far to see clearly. But it wasn't the wind making the trees move that way. The figure watched, unmoving, for a long time. Then turned and vanished into the brush. Elias's jaw clenched. Junie looked up at him, her eyes huge. "Go inside," he said. She obeyed. But as she passed, her hand brushed his. Light as a ghost. Warm as a flame. 2 nights later, a rock crashed through the front window. Elias was out of his chair in a second, rifle drawn. He ran outside. No one there, just a note nailed to the post. She don't belong to you. You got 3 days. Elias burned the note. Didn't tell Junie. But the next day he started sleeping with his rifle beside the door again. The town heard whispers. That Elias had crossed someone. That the girl brought bad luck. That maybe she was more than just a child. Maybe she was something else. At church no one sat near them. The preacher avoided his eye during the sermon on mercy. Still Elias kept showing up. Still Junie kept folding the hymn book pages into tiny birds and leaving them on the pew when they left. On the 4th Sunday, Junie dropped her bird at the preacher's feet. He bent, picked it up, and looked at her with something close to shame in his eyes. Back at the ranch, Elias was chopping wood when Junie appeared beside him with a single dandelion. She offered it like an apology. He knelt to her level. You don't have to earn your place here. She stared at him. Something shifted. And then, for the first time since the auction, she opened her mouth. A single word. Fragile. Dusty. Like it had been locked inside her too long. Why? He didn't know how to answer. He stood, looked out at the prairie, then said, because someone should have, back when I needed it. That night she spoke again. Only one sentence. Quiet from her cot. Almost swallowed by the wind. My mama died singing to me. Elias didn't ask anything else. Just sat on the porch again until dawn, eyes on the stars that had never listened before, wondering if they might now. The next morning he found her in the barn, drawing again in the dust. This time the figures had faces. One with a beard. One with a braid. They stood beside a house with 2 chairs on the porch. Elias felt something rise in his chest. He nodded once. Let's build you a real bed. Junie smiled. It was small. Almost missed. But it was the first one. And Elias, for the first time in years, found himself whispering a word he thought he'd buried forever. Amen. The morning began with the crows screaming over the ridge. Not their usual chatter, but a guttural noise like something had bled beneath the trees. Elias stood at the edge of the pasture, staring westward. He didn't say a word. The sky looked bruised, the clouds stitched low and gray. Junie sat near the porch with a handful of pebbles, arranging them in a new shape, sharp corners this time, not circles. Her fingers moved faster than usual, jittery. She looked up. They're closer. Elias didn't ask how she knew. She always knew before the world did. Later, while fixing the fence near the old cattle gate, Elias spotted movement near the treeline. A flicker of color. Someone watching. He moved slow, hand tightening on his rifle. When he looked again, the figure was gone. That night, he bolted the doors and set extra logs in the fire. Junie drew on the floor with coal, 3 small houses, one with smoke rising from the roof, the others burnt black. She didn't explain. She didn't have to. They didn't sleep. By the 2nd day, Elias rode into town. At the saloon, the air was thick with pipe smoke and suspicion. Folks paused when he walked in. He asked about travelers, strangers, men asking for girls. One man, a cowhand from Bitter Hollow, shrugged and said, some low-lifer came through last week asking after a girl with a doll. Said he'd reclaim what's his. Sheriff told him to get lost. Elias didn't drink. Just left a silver coin on the bar and walked out. Outside, a boy with a crooked smile spat at his boots. She's got bad blood, mister. That girl of yours. Elias stared him down. Say that again. The boy wilted and turned away. But the damage was done. On the way home, Elias spotted boot prints in the riverbed. Big ones. Heavy tread. Not his. Not hers. That evening Junie refused supper. She sat by the door, knees hugged to her chest, whispering the same word under her breath. Cabin. 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 Elias knew the one she met. Northridge. Old hunting shelter. Half burned, abandoned years ago after a lightning strike. He saddled the horse and told Junie to stay inside. She shook her head. If you go alone, I won't be here when you get back. Her voice had never sounded more certain. So he took her. They rode at dusk, the wind thick with pollen and smoke. The cabin came into view just as the sun dropped behind the canyon. Its roof sagged. The door hung crooked. Ash still darkened the stones of the chimney. Junie clutched her doll like it might shatter. Inside they found an empty flask, a burnt match, and a page torn from a Bible. One word circled in red, obedience. Junie stepped to the hearth, bent low, pulled something from beneath the stone. A locket. She opened it. Inside was a charcoal sketch of a woman and child. Her hand trembled. This was mine, she whispered. Then the shot rang out. Elias tackled her just as the bullet shattered the window. They rolled behind the hearth. Another shot, splintering wood. Then silence. Elias peeked through a crack in the wall. A figure moved in the tree line, rifle slung, face hidden beneath a bandana. Junie reached for something in the ash. A shard of glass. "Stay low," Elias said, shoving his revolver into his belt. He slipped around the back, boots soundless on the dry pine needles. Junie waited in the dark, heart hammering. She heard the scuffle before she saw it. Boots, breath, a curse in the dark. Then Elias staggered in, dragging the man by the collar. Junie stared. It wasn't just a drifter. It was the same man from the town square weeks ago, the one claiming to be her kin. Now bleeding from a split lip, one eye swelling shut. Elias tossed him to the ground. "Who sent you?" The man spat. "She's property. No one owns her," Elias growled. Junie stepped forward. Her voice calm. "He's not my uncle." Elias raised his brow. She continued. "He's the one who set fire to our wagon." Mama screamed. He said she disobeyed. "I ran when the wheels burned. I ran so far I stopped remembering my name." Elias stared at the man. His jaw clenched. "You killed her mother?" The man sneered. "She was promised. Her mama broke the deal. That was enough." Elias stepped forward, fist drawn, but Junie caught his sleeve. "No," she whispered. He looked down. Her eyes weren't angry. They were tired. "I want to leave him to the dust," she said. Elias stared a long moment, then nodded. They tied the man to a post. Left water beside him. Took his horse and rifle. He could walk, if he lasted the night. They didn't look back. By the time they reached the ranch, dawn was rising like a wound across the prairie. Junie didn't go inside. She sat on the porch, the locket clutched tight, the doll beside her. Elias joined her. Neither spoke for a long while. Finally Junie said, "I'm not afraid anymore." He nodded. "Good." Then she added, softer, "But I don't know where I belong." Elias looked at the prairie stretching endless before them. Then at the little house behind. And finally at the girl who had never stopped surviving. "You belong where you're safe," he said. "And safe is wherever you decide to build." She smiled, faint and full of truth. Elias leaned back in his chair. "We'll build something better this time." "And if they come again?" Elias glanced toward the rifle beside the door. "Let them come," he said. And that was the end of running. The man Elias left tied to the post never made it to the next ridge. Buzzards found him before anyone else did. 2 days later, Sheriff McAllen rode up to the ranch with dust in his mouth and guilt in his eyes. He said nothing at first, just handed Elias a weather-stained paper folded into fourths. On it was a sketch, Junie's face or something close to it. Beside her likeness, missing. June Lily Callahan. Last seen after caravan ambush near Three Forks. "She ain't the first," the sheriff muttered, spitting into the dirt. "But she's the first who came back." Junie stood at the doorway behind them, arms crossed. She looked small, but the kind of small that refuses to bend. She didn't flinch when the sheriff said her name. She just stepped outside, took the paper from Elias's hand, and folded it slowly, with more grace than any girl her age should have learned. "I remember now," she said. "All of it." Elias waited. "There were 6 of us. Families moving west. He followed us. Said he had God's blessing and our contracts. Mama said no. She said no real God would trade a daughter for land. He set fire to the wagons. Shot the oxen. Anyone who ran he cut down." The sheriff listened in silence. "I crawled into the root cellar with Mama's doll. That's how I lived. That's where the fire didn't reach." Sheriff McAllen scratched his jaw. "A girl survives that kind of hell, most folks would call it a miracle." Junie looked past him. It didn't feel like one. Word spread fast once the sheriff rode back into town. By sundown, half the county knew what had happened. Knew who Elias had taken in. Knew what kind of man they'd let pass through their streets without asking questions. The town's smiles turned stiff. Their laughter dulled. And for the first time, people started walking on the far side of the road when Elias came through. Not out of scorn. Out of shame. Miss Clary from the bakery was the first to knock. She brought a basket of warm bread and a jar of peach preserves. She didn't speak much, just handed it over and touched Junie's cheek before leaving. Then came the schoolteacher, Mr. Brecken, who mumbled something about lessons if she ever wanted. He shuffled his feet and kept his eyes low, like he'd missed something he shouldn't have. But the worst visit came from the preacher. He brought his Bible, his long face and too many words. "I believe," he said slowly, "the Lord tests us in ways we can't understand. Sometimes children are taken down dark paths so they can one day become light for others. Junie stared at him. Elias stepped in, voice flat as a canyon wall. She doesn't owe you redemption. Or this town. The preacher flushed and left before finishing his sermon. That night, Junie helped Elias stack firewood beneath the porch. She didn't speak until the last log dropped. Do you think they really didn't know? He didn't answer at first. Then, I think they didn't want to. The next morning, someone nailed a cross to Elias's gate. Not out of hatred but cowardice. An apology in disguise. Elias tore it down without a word and burned it in the stove. Junie took the ashes and scattered them by the grove, where her mice were buried. The town grew quieter. No more gossip outside the store. No more sideways glances. They'd run out of ways to pretend nothing happened. Elias kept to his chores. Junie to her drawings. But something shifted. They were no longer alone. They were being watched, not by cruelty but by conscience. A week passed. Then came the letter. It arrived in a creased envelope with no return mark. Elias opened it by the window, the light falling across lines written in a woman's hand. My name is Sarah Callahan. I am June Lily's aunt. We thought she died with the rest. I only just saw the sketch in a town posting. If she lives, I will come. Elias read it twice. Junie stood beside him the third time. She didn't blink as he finished. I don't remember her, she said. But Mama used to whisper that name at night. Sarah. Do you want her to come? I don't know. Elias folded the letter, set it beside the lamp. We'll wait then. Days crawled by like snowmelt, slow and silent. Junie didn't draw that week. Instead, she spent hours in the field behind the barn, building something out of fallen limbs and rope scraps. A sort of shelter but strange, circular, hollow in the center, facing east. Elias didn't ask. On the fifth morning, a wagon came down the road. Not fast. Not slow. Just steady. The woman who stepped down was strong-shouldered, wide-eyed, with hands like someone who'd buried too many and kept going anyway. June? She asked. Junie stepped forward. Her hair was braided, her dress clean, the doll still at her side. Do you remember this? The woman asked, pulling out a carved button. Junie nodded. That was Mama's coat. They embraced. Elias turned away. Some things weren't meant to be watched. Later, Sarah sat on the porch with Elias. She spoke of her sister, how she'd begged to go west. How no one listened, how the last letter came with blood on the fold. She was the only one who loved me right, Sarah said. And now, this girl. She's all that's left. She's not just what's left, Elias replied. She's what's next. Junie sat alone near the willow tree, legs crossed, staring at the horizon. Elias walked over. Sat beside her. She yours now? He asked gently. Junie didn't speak. Then, she's blood. But you're the reason I'm still here. He nodded once, hands folded between his knees. Then maybe we both stay. Can we build another chair? She asked. Like the one you carved for me. We can build 10. She smiled. Just one. Beside yours. The next day, the town gathered without invitation. They brought lumber, nails, paint, a bucket of sweet tea. It wasn't an apology, not in words. But it was something. They helped build a new porch. Bigger. With 2 chairs side by side. No one said it outright, but they all knew. This ranch, this girl, this man, they were part of the town now. Not because the town had earned it, but because the girl had survived it. That evening, Junie sat beside Elias. The sky was wide and red. The prairie breathed. You know, Elias said, some ghosts don't leave because they've got something left to witness. Junie leaned against him. Then I'm glad you stayed. He put his arm around her shoulders. And for the first time in years, Elias Grant didn't feel like a man with nothing left. He felt like a man who'd finally built something that would last. The first frost of winter came silent and sudden, brushing the prairie grass silver before dawn. Elias stood on the porch wrapped in his old coat, watching the steam rise from his coffee, the fields lying bare and ready for sleep. Behind him, the cabin creaked like it always did when the wind shifted east. But now there were 2 chairs on the porch. And one was not empty. Junie sat beside him, legs tucked under a blanket she had stitched herself. Her hair was longer now, neatly braided down her back. She had grown taller, but not just in inches. There was steadiness in her now, like she'd been forged, not just spared. And she watched the land like someone who finally knew she belonged to it. The woman, Sarah, had stayed for 2 weeks before heading back south with promises to write, her heart lighter, her burden shared. She'd offered to take Junie to bring her to a house with schoolbooks, neighbors, laughter. Junie had listened quietly, then shook her head. "My home is here," she'd said. "I already chose." And Elias, for the first time, didn't argue with fate. The town changed too, though not all at once. It came in slow gestures, Mr. Coulter nodding at Junie in the market, the preacher planting flowers by the chapel in her mother's name, Miss Clary teaching her how to knead dough with soft hands and a whistle. One day Elias found Junie talking to the widow down by the river, offering to teach her son how to set traps. It wasn't the words that struck him. It was the way Junie laughed. Elias hadn't known how much he needed to hear that sound until it echoed across the water. The cabin grew warmer, not just with fire, but with rhythm. There were routines now. Junie swept the porch at sunrise, fed the chickens at noon, read from the old Bible before bed. Not because she had to, but because she liked the stories. Especially the ones with rescue, mercy, and impossible second chances. Elias carved during the cold evenings. He shaped wood into animals, whistles, even a lopsided cat that Junie pretended was fierce. But the piece he labored over most was a new chair. Sturdy, wide, with smooth arms and a single carving on the back, a bloom of juniper flowers curling around a star. He didn't present it like a gift. Just placed it beside his one evening, poured her cocoa and said, "You earned your own place on this porch." She smiled, ran her fingers over the carving, and sat without a word. That night a storm rolled in. Wind slapped the shutters. The roof groaned. Elias bolted the windows, stoked the fire. Junie didn't flinch. She stood beside him, handing him the wood before he asked. When the thunder cracked like gunfire overhead, she said only, "Let it pass." He looked at her. The girl who once knelt shaking in his barn was now standing tall with her feet firm on the ground. The next morning, the prairie shimmered under a crust of snow. A deer stood at the edge of the trees watching the cabin. Elias nodded toward it. "You ever wonder what they see when they look at us?" Junie tilted her head. "Maybe not ghosts anymore." He looked at her. "Not ghosts." She leaned forward, resting her elbows on the chair's arms. "I think they see a home." There was a pause, deep and good. He let the silence stretch like warm molasses. Then down the road dust rose. A wagon approached, fast. Sheriff McAllen at the reins. Behind him, a boy holding his leg, blood dark on his trousers. Town trouble again. Always came in gusts. Elias stood. So did Junie. He reached for his rifle. She reached for her coat. McAllen didn't even slow the wagon. Raiders hit the north trail. 2 boys missing. Can't spare a search party. Elias didn't wait for more. Which way? Over the dry gulch. Might have taken shelter near Miller's Bluff. I'll ride out. Junie's eyes burned. He turned to her. You stay here. No, she said. You don't go alone anymore. And he didn't argue. The ride through the dry gulch was rough, wind cutting, tracks half swallowed by last night's storm. They found the first boy just before dusk, huddled in a hollow log. The second lay farther on, caught under a fallen branch, leg twisted but breathing. Elias carried him, Junie lighting the trail with her lantern, walking ahead like she'd always belonged to the dark. They returned near midnight. Town folk gathered near the livery, wide-eyed, silent. Elias handed the boy to his mother. No speeches. No applause. Just tired nods and grateful tears. Back home, Junie lit a single candle. Sat on her chair. Elias sat beside her. The storm had passed, but the wind still whispered. You remember the auction? He asked softly. I remember the silence, she said. And now? She looked at him, full in the face. Now I remember the chair. His voice caught. But he didn't look away. You built this life with me, he said. You chose to stay. I did, she whispered. Because you made room for me. Before I knew what that meant. He nodded, eyes wet. Not from sorrow this time. But from the ache of something long denied and finally found. They sat together until the candle burned low. And just before it flickered out, Junie reached for his hand. Tell me a story, she said. Elias smiled. A story about what? About a man with nothing left, who found something worth living for. He chuckled under his breath. I know that one, he said. By heart. And in the hush that followed, as the cold wrapped around the cabin and the stars blinked wide over the prairie, the porch held them both. 2 chairs. 2 souls. And no ghosts left between them. If you're still here, still listening, ask yourself this. What would you have done if you saw a little girl standing on an auction block? Would you have turned away? Or would you have made space for one more chair? The wind pressed cold against the warped wood of the Maynard attic, whistling through slits where nails had lifted long ago. Dust spiraled slowly in golden shafts of winter light, and beneath the slanted ceiling Eloise Maynard sat on a quilt too thin for the season, her back against the wall, one hand pressed to the swell of her belly. 7 months along, maybe more, she'd lost track. Time was measured differently now, not by calendars or church bells, but by the creak of Cora's steps on the stair, the silence after soup was left outside the door, the scrape of a lock being turned. No one called her by name anymore. Once she'd been a bride in lace, a girl whose laughter floated over the dry grass and painted the world in color. Now her reflection in the attic's narrow mirror, a shard half buried in a drawer, was someone else entirely, pale lips, hollowed cheeks, eyes sunken like candle stubs in the dark. She ran her hand over her roundness, skin stretched and warm, and whispered to the child, "I'm still here. Don't forget me." Outside, the bell from St. Simeon's rang slow and distant. The town gathered for Sunday sermon while she remained a ghost above their heads, locked away like a sin. The door opened just wide enough for a bowl to slide in. Cora didn't speak. She never did. The woman had eyes like river rocks, flat, dull, unmoved. Once, Eloise had begged her for a letter, for word of her husband. The slap that followed came quick and clean, like she was erasing chalk. The bowl was thick with root stew and little salt. She forced it down slowly. Anything not eaten was noted, punished. Sometimes by silence. Sometimes by words that cut deeper than hunger. "Your shame is ours," Cora had once hissed. "You think you're owed sympathy? You seduced a Maynard and look what's come of it. You want pity? Pray." But she did pray. Not for pity, but for someone to remember her as she was. Before the wedding night. Before he rode away. Before Reverend Maynard took one look at the blood on the sheets and decided she was no wife at all. A beam above her head bore a child's carving, M and B, locked in a heart. Probably someone else's initials. But she traced them like they were hers, and as they once might have been in another life. She leaned close to the slatted window and pressed her face to the cold glass. From here she could just barely see the road that led down from the ridge. The same road had disappeared down 3 months after their vows. One letter came, then nothing. Rumors followed. Bounty hunters, a duel gone wrong, debts too deep to outrun. Some said he was dead. Some hoped he was. She no longer knew which she believed. A voice drifted up from below, Rosie, the neighbor girl, singing softly as she walked past the house with her rag doll. 6 years old, barefoot in snow, loved more than Eloise had ever been under this roof. She pressed her palm to the glass, but the girl didn't look up. No one ever did. That was the point. The attic kept the Maynard name clean. No scandal on the church rolls, no whispers in the general store. Just a girl tucked upstairs, hidden with the spare linens and old trunks. The sun lowered toward the hills, softening the edges of the world. Eloise clutched her shawl tighter and lit the single candle she was allowed. The flame flickered uncertainly, as if even it felt unwelcome. And then she saw it. A man rode slowly into view, horse dark and dust-colored, coat stiff with weather. He didn't look up, just passed beneath the sycamore with a weight that made his shoulders seem carved from stone. But there was no mistaking the way he carried his left side, just a fraction slower. No mistaking the long scar that curved from cheekbone to jaw. Her breath caught, fragile and unfinished. She didn't scream. Didn't call out. Just pressed her forehead to the glass as if it might open. His head turned slightly as he reached the crossroads, as though something called to him, invisible and faint, but he didn't stop. He disappeared behind the mercantile. She pressed a hand to her belly. The baby kicked. It was the first time in weeks. Below, the house creaked with cold, the walls breathing like an old man trying to remember warmth. Cora's voice drifted up, stern, hurried. "He's back. The prodigal ghost." Then silence. The word back echoed in her ribs. A long time ago, had touched her face like it was a prayer and said he'd never leave. That promises meant more than paper. That he'd come back when it was safe. But safe from what? He never told. Just kissed her slow that last night and rode away before dawn. Her letters went unanswered. Her name was stripped from town gossip and family grace. When her belly began to show, the judgment came swift. The shame was branded on her like a cattle mark. She stood now, legs unsteady, and walked to the little drawer where she kept scraps of paper. Letters she'd written but never sent. Pieces of herself stitched into words she feared no one would read. She picked up the one she started the day her husband vanished, dated 2 winters past. Folded it gently and slid it beneath the floorboard. If she died here, someone should know what she tried to say. A soft knock startled her. She froze. No one knocked. She approached the door slowly, heart rising like a bird flushed from brush. Another knock, gentle, deliberate. Not Cora. Not the Reverend. She placed her ear to the wood. Silence. Then, just barely, something slid under the door. A single envelope. No name, no seal. She waited. Counted to 50. Opened it. Inside, a piece of paper, folded once, trembling with cold. On it, I'm not gone. And you're not forgotten. Her knees buckled. She fell against the door, pressing the note to her chest like it might restart her heart. Downstairs the fire crackled. Footsteps moved. Doors opened and closed. But above them all, in a space meant to contain shame, a spark returned. She whispered his name once, not a prayer, not a plea. Just memory given breath. Outside, snow began to fall. She sat near the slats in the window again, watching the white cover the world. And for the first time in a long time, she waited for morning. Not as punishment, but as promise. The man in the dust-colored hat rode into town like a secret coming home. No trumpet, no trail of smoke, just the creak of a worn saddle and the low breath of a horse that had seen too many miles. His coat was stained at the edges with road and weather, and one side of his face caught the sun wrong, scarred, like lightning had tried to write something across it and gave up halfway. McAllister didn't speak when the stable hand offered to tie up his horse. He simply nodded once, handed over the reins and walked toward the churchyard. The bell tower stood crooked, a bird's nest tucked near the top beam. The town hadn't fixed it in years, but it still rang on Sundays, still made folks pretend they were something cleaner than dust and pride. Stopped at the iron gate, stared at the cracked headstone just inside. Amelia Jane, beloved wife and mother. Not his kin. Not anyone's he knew. But he stood there like it gave him permission to return. Folks watched. From behind curtains, from porch rockers, from inside the general store. A few whispered, "Is that McAllister? I thought he was dead. Didn't he run off with silver from Carson's safe?" The truth didn't matter here. Stories moved quicker than horses and they never needed saddles. Walked past the church and sat on a bench beneath a withered cottonwood. The wood groaned under his weight as if surprised it was still needed. He pulled a small tin from his coat, lit a match and took a long, quiet drag from a hand-rolled cigarette. The smoke curled slow around him, softening his scarred face like a veil. His eyes stayed on the hill to the north, where the Maynard house stood like a judgment passed down from heaven itself. He had left her there. And now she was up in that attic. He hadn't known until yesterday. Word reached him through a telegraph clerk outside St. Helena. The clerk's sister lived here. Mentioned a girl locked in a room for shaming the family. Pregnant, alone. The story had a name, though the clerk didn't speak it. But knew. He'd known the minute he read the words Maynard attic. Eloise. He closed his eyes and leaned his head back, listening. The town hadn't changed. Same brittle wind. Same hush that wrapped itself around your boots and asked you to forget where you'd come from. He felt the weight in his coat pocket. A letter, and signed, unwitnessed, written to the child he hadn't met. A small voice startled him. "You came back," said the girl, no more than 6, standing barefoot in the cold with a doll missing an eye. He looked at her, surprised. "You know me?" She shrugged. "No. But the lady in the attic talks about you when she sings." He didn't answer right away. Just studied her. Her cheeks were pink from the cold, and her dress was patched in 3 places. She looked like she lived just outside of people's kindness. "What's your name?" "Rosie," she said, swinging the doll by its arm. "She cries sometimes. The lady. I seen her through the attic slats. Sometimes I wave. I think she waves back, but maybe she's brushing hair." His jaw clenched. "Does anyone else know?" Rosie kicked the dirt. "My mama says not to talk about the Maynett's. She says they keep clean by keeping others dirty." That sounded about right. He reached into his coat, pulled out a wrapped caramel and held it out. Rosie hesitated, then took it and curtsied like she'd been taught better days ago. "Thank you, mister." Stood, watched her wander off. Then he turned and walked toward the Maynard property, boots crunching over gravel like slow thunder. He didn't go to the front. Not yet. He stopped just beyond the gate, stared at the house. It loomed tall, all stern lines and shutters drawn tight like lips refusing to speak. No smoke from the chimney. Just stillness. But upstairs, near the corner window, a sliver of curtain had moved. He stepped closer. She was there. Pale against the glass, eyes wide as winter sky. Her fingers touched the pane as if they could cross distance, could brush his cheek like they used to before shame built walls higher than fences. He didn't wave. He didn't smile. He just looked at her like a man trying to remember how to breathe. Inside, she vanished from view. Exhaled, turned, and walked toward the old fence on the side yard. It leaned like it had given up. He pressed a palm to one of the posts. The wood was soft with rot. He found a loose rail and lifted it. The next morning, folks found at the fence with a hammer and nails. He said nothing. Just worked. One board. Then another. Each one straight. Each one set like he owed someone something he couldn't name. By sundown, he had the whole section mended. On the third day, he left a red apple on the gatepost. The fourth, a small shawl. Hand-stitched. He traded for it in town. No one saw him leave the gifts. But Eloise found them. Each one. Her hands trembled when she lifted the shawl, pressed it to her cheek, and rocked slowly on the attic floor, the child stirring against her ribs. He didn't come to the house again that week. Not close. Just stood at a distance. Watching. Measuring the space between past and forgiveness. On the seventh night, when the moon was thin and cruel, the attic light flickered like a heartbeat. Stood near the cottonwood, hat low, coat pulled tight. He didn't know if she could see him. He hoped she could. Cora Maynard stood on the porch, arms crossed. "He won't stay," she said to the air. But the air didn't answer. The town was too quiet for that. Too used to forgetting its sinners. Eloise wrote that night in the dark. No ink. Just pressure of pen against old paper, words she traced over and over. She didn't need to read them. She'd memorized them long ago. The child kicked again. Stronger this time. She whispered, "He's come back, little one." Whether that means hope or more heartbreak, I don't know. But he's here. 3 nights later, the pipe burst in the kitchen. Cold snapped it clean. Water pooled beneath the floorboards. Cora and the Reverend left for town. That's when came. Not like a hero. Not with fists or fury. He knocked once. Soft. Eloise froze. The candle had long burned out. She moved toward the door like in a dream. His voice low. "If you want me gone, I'll go. But I never forgot." Silence. Then the lock turned. The door creaked open. He stood there, taller than she remembered, scar catching the light, eyes hollow but steady. He looked at her like she was made of breath and bone and sorrow, and he had missed every part. She didn't speak. Just stepped aside. He didn't enter. Not fully. He placed something on the attic floor. A sealed letter. "I don't expect forgiveness," he said. "Just wanted you to know. I kept something for you." Then he left. She knelt beside the letter, hands trembling. Inside a deed. Signed in his name. Transferring his land to the child's name upon birth. Witnessed by the sheriff, notarized in the next county. It wasn't just a gesture. It was a promise. Downstairs, the house sighed with cold wind returning. But above it, in that quiet room, a woman closed her eyes and wept without shame. And somewhere beyond the trees, McAllister walked into the night, the weight of the past lighter by one step. The next morning, frost clung to the window panes like lace stitched by sorrow. Inside the attic, Eloise sat cross-legged on the quilt, the letter from resting open in her lap, creased at the corners where her hands had trembled too long. She hadn't slept. Every time she closed her eyes, his voice returned, not just the words but the way he'd spoken them. Gentle. Bare. As though anything louder might break the world apart. Downstairs, footsteps moved with clipped intent. Cora. The woman's heels struck with like accusations. There was no mention of the burst pipe, no apology for the cold that had crept into the attic like a second skin. Just a bowl of gray porridge pushed through the door and the sound of the lock twisting shut again. Eloise didn't eat. She pulled the shawl had left around her shoulders and moved to the small vent slats near the window. Below, the world was still. No voices. No wheels. No church bells. Just winter breathing across the land like it owned everything. Then movement. He was at the side of the house, coat buttoned high, hands bare against the cold. He carried a long plank of wood and knelt beside the fence where it had splintered anew. His work was quiet, precise, each nail driven not in haste, but with intent, as if every board he mended restored a part of something lost. He didn't look up. Not once. Eloise watched him for an hour, maybe more, until the ache in her knees reminded her she hadn't moved. When he finally stood, brushing snow from his sleeves, he left something behind. A parcel, small, wrapped in canvas. He didn't wait to see it taken. She waited till the moon rose before she dared open the attic door. No one stirred in the house. Cora and the Reverend had left for prayer circle, a spectacle of devotion to conceal the rot inside their walls. Eloise crept down the attic stairs for the first time in weeks, toes brushing the floor like they were foreign ground. At the threshold, she paused, heart rattling against her ribs. Then she opened the door and stepped into the hallway's hush. Outside, the bundle waited, half buried in snow. Inside it, a pair of soft leather gloves, worn but warm, and a small red baby bonnet stitched by hand. The color startled her. She hadn't seen red in so long, not real red. Not color that pulsed like hope. She clutched the bonnet to her chest and wept. The next day she left nothing at the window, but at dusk returned. This time with a loaf of bread, steam still faintly rising from the cloth around it. He placed it on the steps and sat on the porch for a moment, hat in his hands as if listening for something. She didn't show herself. She couldn't. But when he walked away, she watched until he disappeared into the pale light. The pattern continued. Day after day, gesture after gesture. A carved wooden rattle. A candle in a tin. Dried lavender bundled in twine. Each offering left without ceremony, without demand. And still he never knocked again. Only once did he look up. It was near sundown, and snow had begun to fall again in slow, thick flakes. Stood in the yard, his breath curling like ghost speech in the air. Then his gaze lifted, straight to the attic window. Eloise did not flinch. She stood there, silhouetted by the candle behind her, eyes meeting his through layers of glass in silence. She didn't smile. Neither did he. But something shifted, an invisible string between them tightening, not with urgency but with certainty. Later that night she wrote for the child again. He comes without asking. Leaves without anger. And I don't know if that's mercy or punishment, but it makes the air warmer somehow. I don't know if we'll ever be free. But I know now we're not forgotten. By the fourth week a knock did come. That's chorus. Sharper. You've been stealing from the porch? Her voice cracked the air like a whip. Eloise didn't answer. I told your husband once that your softness would ruin everything. Cora's mouth curled. He didn't listen. But he paid for it. Eloise turned her face toward the window. He's not dead. No. But he's marked. You saw his face, didn't you? Cora leaned in. You think scars change men? They don't. They just change how the world sees them. He's still the same boy who left you when it got hard. Eloise stood. And for the first time in months she met Cora's eyes. Maybe, she said softly. But at least he came back. Cora stiffened. Foolish girl. But Eloise didn't back down. That night, the wind howled hard enough to lift shutters. She couldn't sleep. The baby rolled low, heavy and urgent. She walked slowly to the window and opened it just a crack. The cold burned her throat. She leaned out, looked down. The yard was empty. So, she took a long cord from an old curtain and tied it to the shawl had left. Then carefully she lowered it down from the window, the wool trailing like a flag of surrender. It hung there for minutes. Then from the shadows a hand emerged. Stepped forward, slow and deliberate, and attached something to the end of the cord. A blanket. White, soft, folded. He looked up only once. His eyes reached her like fire without flame. Then he stepped back into the dark and was gone. She pulled the blanket up like a lifeline, trembling, and held it to her face. It smelled of cedar and snow. The next morning the town buzzed. Rosie had told someone. Or someone else had seen on the porch. Whispers stirred again. He's leaving things. For her? Shameless. That whole house is cursed. Reverend Maynard slammed the door that evening when he came home. But Eloise no longer listened through the floorboards. Instead she wrote. To herself. To the child. The words were short. Spare. Like small lights in a mine tunnel. That night she opened the window again. No shawl this time. Just a single sheet of paper folded into a square, held by a clothespin on a string. Hours passed. Then it was gone. And when she woke at dawn, another note was in its place. It said only, I remember the way you danced when you thought no one saw. She laughed aloud. Not because it was funny, but because something long dead inside her had stirred, and it made the air shimmer. The next night she sat by the slats, humming. Rosie waved from the road. Eloise waved back. From his camp just outside town, watched the house glow with soft lamplight. He didn't move closer. He didn't need to. He knew something had changed. Inside the attic, Eloise cradled the blanket and whispered to her unborn child. Your father has not spoken of love. But he's spelling it out with wood and cloth and silence. And that might be better than any vow ever sworn too loud. She lay back on the quilt, the candle flickering low, and let her hand rest over her belly. Outside, snow continued to fall, soft and unending, like time had decided to pause, for just a little while, so love could try again. The attic no longer felt like a tomb. It breathed now, slowly, cautiously, like lungs after a long illness. Light seeped in more freely, through slats that had once been sealed with grime and shame. The single candle had become two, and the floor beneath Eloise's feet no longer felt like punishment but like a space waiting to be redefined. She moved differently too, still careful, still slow but no longer shrinking. The baby's movements had become stronger, more certain, as though it could feel the shift in her spirit and was anchoring itself to her hope. Below, voices rose more often. Not just Cora's sharp commands or the Reverend's mutterings, but other voices, murmurs from town. The kind that traveled through wooden fences, across dust roads, beneath the boots of those who looked too long at the Maynard house and then turned away. Something was being whispered into the town's corners, and it sounded like her name. Eloise first noticed it when Mrs. Tate, the widow who kept to herself, left a warm pie on the Maynard porch and walked away without knocking. Cora found it, scoffed, and threw it into the backyard. But Eloise had seen it from above. Cherry. Still steaming. The next morning she found a note slipped beneath her door in unfamiliar handwriting. Only 5 words, "We see you. Keep going." She pressed it to her lips and whispered, "They're watching." Not out of malice. Not anymore. Out of memory. Out of guilt. Didn't come for 3 days after the note. She began to wonder if he'd left again, if the weight of old wounds had sent him wandering. Her hand hovered over the shawl he'd once left, folded now in a chest of small things, the quiet archive of a romance too careful to speak its name. But on the 4th evening she saw him from the attic slats, hat in hand, standing just past the fence line like he didn't know if he belonged anymore. He didn't move closer. He just looked up. One slow glance. His eyes met hers. Then he turned away. Not as retreat. As pause. That night, Eloise left the window open and tied a small note to the string that had once carried blankets and baby bonnets. One word, stay. When she returned in the morning, the note was gone. And beside the string hung a silver locket, tarnished, simple, old. Inside was a folded picture of her. From a fair long ago. When her cheeks still carried the blush of innocence and the wind hadn't yet carved sorrow into her skin. He had kept it all this time. Her fingers trembled. She wore it around her neck without hesitation. Below, town voices rose louder. S' name now carried less contempt and more curiosity. He had visited the blacksmith, bought nails and timber. He had spoken to the sheriff, quietly, firmly. No one knew the conversation's content, only that the sheriff tipped his hat as left, a rare gesture in a town that rarely gave second chances. And then Rosie spoke. The little girl with the doll stood in front of the general store, hands on her hips, and told anyone who'd listened that the lady in the attic had smiled, that she had waved, that she had hair like the inside of a chestnut and sang better than the preacher's wife. Children never knew what secrets to keep. The sheriff passed it on to his wife, who passed it to Mrs. Tate, who passed it into every fabric shop and feed barn for 30 miles. By week's end the town knew. She was still there. Still carrying the child. Still. Reverend Maynard doubled down. He forbade guess. Refused to answer questions. Stood on the church steps and preached about modesty, virtue, and the dangers of fallen women. But even his voice couldn't cover the sound of whispers no longer afraid to be heard. The attic was no longer her cell. It had become her watchtower. That night stood beneath her window again. He didn't call. He didn't knock. He simply waited. When she opened the pane, the cold air rushed in like an old friend. "Are you afraid?" she asked softly. "Of what?" "What they'll say. What they'll always say." He took off his hat, held it against his chest. "Let them. I've spent too long listening to everyone but my own heart." She closed her eyes. The baby shifted inside her. "I have a name for her," she whispered. He didn't move. "I want to name her Hope." For a long moment he said nothing. Then quietly, "That's a name worth building a life around." The next morning the sheriff returned. But not for Reverend Maynard. The Reverend stepped out onto the porch, adjusting his collar with fingers that trembled. "You dare question me?" The sheriff didn't raise his voice. "Town's changing. They're asking questions. About her. About the attic. About what's been hidden. She is under my care. She's not your property. I gave her shelter." The sheriff looked up toward the attic window. Eloise was standing there, visible now, fully, no longer a shadow. Her hand rested on the curve of her stomach. Her eyes met his. "She's given this town something to reckon with," the sheriff said. "That takes courage. I'd reckon we owe her the dignity to see daylight." That night left nothing on the porch. No gift. No bread. No note. But she found him just past midnight, kneeling by the willow near the yard. He didn't see her approach from the attic's back stair, the one she hadn't used in months. She walked to him without sound. When he turned, his face changed. Like something inside him had unclenched. You came down. I wanted to remember how it felt to breathe open air. He looked at her hands. One held the baby blanket. The other the locket. I'm not asking for forgiveness, he said. I'm not offering it, she replied. Then a pause. But I'm offering a beginning. They stood there in the snow, not touching, not speaking, just sharing a silence that no longer hurt. The next day, 2 women knocked on the Maynard door. Mrs. Tate and the sheriff's wife. Cora opened it, face like iron. We brought soup, said Mrs. Tate. For the girl upstairs. She doesn't take visitors. We're not visiting, the sheriff's wife replied. We're seeing. From above, Eloise watched it unfold. The tide had turned. Not because of shouts, but because one man had kept returning. Because kindness had worn down stone. Because hope, when offered quietly, could still be heard. As the sun dipped low, painting the sky in orange and mercy, stood at the gate, a parcel in his hand. He looked up once more, then tied it gently to the latch. She opened it that night beneath her candlelight. Inside, a simple note in his hand. If I could go back, I'd never leave that room where you first said my name like it meant something. But I'm here now. And I'll stay until you believe it too. She smiled. Not because everything was fixed, but because something was no longer broken. And sometimes, that's how love begins again. The wind rose hard at dawn, as if it had been holding its breath for too long and could no longer bear the weight of all the things unsaid. The Maynard house stood brittle against the rising gusts, its shutters clapping like startled hands, the chimney groaning under the strain of another storm rolling in. The snow fell sideways, not gentle this time, but slanting and fast, whispering warnings against every window pane. And up in the attic, Eloise felt something inside her shift. Not just the baby, not just the weight of her body, but something deeper, older, more final. She clutched the edge of the dresser for balance as the pain tightened across her back like a band pulled too taut. It stole her breath, left her bent and sweating beneath layers of wool. Her knees buckled once and she barely made it to the quilt, sinking to her side as another wave crested, fiercer than the first. Downstairs, the world remained unaware. Cora was at the parlor window muttering about sinners and scandal. Reverend Maynard read from his prayer book aloud, voice flat, more for performance than devotion. No one noticed the shallow gasps above. No one heard the whisper of her voice as she called out, not for them, but for. Another contraction bent her into herself. This time a small cry escaped, sharp and ungraceful. The child within her was coming, not tomorrow, not later, but now. She crawled toward the attic door, breath ragged, fingers slipping on cold wood. She pounded weakly, then stronger, then louder. Each knock a plea, a rebellion, a declaration. The sound echoed through the bones of the house. Cora stiffened. She's at it again. The Reverend barely looked up. Let her. But Rosie heard it from the snow-covered porch where she played with her doll. Her eyes widened. She ran toward the Maynard fence, bare feet slicing through snow. Had been chopping firewood just down the road. He saw the girl running, waving her arms like a flag of alarm. She's screaming. Rosie cried. The lady in the attic. He dropped the axe and ran. The snow bit hard against his boots as he sprinted toward the house. He didn't wait to knock. Didn't speak. Just shouldered the door open, splinters flying. Cora shouted from the parlor, "You have no right." S voice cut through her like thunder. She's having the child. Everything moved at once. Cora lunged toward the stairs but was faster. He took them 3 at a time, heart hammering, breath short. He found her crumpled near the door, face pale, hair soaked with sweat. Her hands clutched her belly like she was holding back a river. It hurts, she whispered, voice breaking. I know, he breathed. I'm here. He gathered her gently as if she were made of paper and carried her down the stairs. Past the portraits, past the silence, past Reverend Maynard, who rose to block the doorway but faltered when stared him down. Out of the way, said low and final. The Reverend didn't move, but he didn't stop him either. Outside the wind howled. Wrapped Eloise in the thickest blanket he could find and hoisted her into the cart. Rosie helped pile furs around her. The horse took off fast, hooves tearing through snow as drove toward the midwife's cabin on the outskirts of town. The ride was rough. Eloise cried out more than once, biting down on her wrist to muffle the sound. Spoke softly the entire way, not promises, not apologies, just her name over and over like a rope to keep her tethered. At the cabin, the midwife, Madame Wilder, opened the door before they arrived. She took one look at Eloise and nodded. You're just in time. Bring her in. Laid her on the prepared bed, then stepped back, helpless for the first time in years. His hands balled at his sides. His scar ached. His knees wanted to fail. But he didn't move. Hours passed. Each scream from the back room carved another line into his face. Each silence was worse. Finally, just before dusk, the cry of a child pierced the air. It was thin, then stronger, then insistent. Madame Wilder stepped into the doorway, wiping her hands on her apron. She did it. S. legs gave way slightly. He caught himself on the doorframe. Both? Both are alive, the midwife said. But they need rest. And they need each other. He stepped into the room like it was a church. Eloise was pale but glowing. A different kind of light. Not candlelight. Not fire. But something internal, a glow that comes only from the brink of pain and the bloom of something sacred. She held the baby in trembling arms, and when stepped closer she didn't flinch. "She's beautiful," he whispered, voice cracking. "She's hope," Eloise murmured, tears slipping down her cheeks. "You gave me her name. And you gave her a father." He reached out and touched the child's tiny hand, barely able to breathe. Then Eloise looked at him with something fierce and quiet in her gaze. "I don't need you to save me," she said. "But I'd like you to stay." He dropped to his knees beside her. "I will," he said. "This time I will." Back in town, people gathered slowly. The news traveled fast, faster than snowmelt in spring. Some said the Reverend had tried to stop it. Some said God had stepped in. But no one denied what came next. A week later, stood beside Eloise at the edge of the churchyard, their child in his arms. He didn't wear a new coat. He didn't wash away the scar. He didn't pretend to be anything other than what he was, a man who had once run from love and now chose to run toward it. The townsfolk watched from porches, from behind lace curtains, from the church pews they'd filled for years with judgment. Spoke only one sentence before the sheriff. "This is my wife. That is our child. And we are staying." No one objected. And when Eloise walked down the street days later, head held high, baby in a sling across her chest, no one turned away. Rosie ran beside her, proud and barefooted. Mrs. Tate sent fresh bread every morning. Even the Reverend nodded once when they passed. Not because he'd forgiven, but because he'd been left behind. At the edge of town, built a house with his own hands. Each plank a page in a new story. Each nail a promise held firm. The attic in this house had windows wide and open, and it smelled of lavender and baby soap. It was not a place to hide. It was a place to begin. And each night, after the lamp was turned down and the child nestled quiet between them, Eloise would rest her head on his chest and feel the scar beneath his collarbone. She never asked how he got it. She didn't need to. Because some scars don't mark shame. Some scars mark return. Some scars are promises that made it home.